Hi everyone, thanks for joining. It's great to see so many people here. I'm Rosie and I'm a senior consultant at GemServe and we're a delivery partner of the Green Heat Network Fund, but today we are talking about BHIVE. I'll just start with some housekeeping. So for any questions, please select the Q&A icon at the top of the pane to ask. If you click it again, it'll close. If you ask any questions, please ask them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. Feel free to post your questions with your name, or you can do it anonymously. Anything we don't get to today, we'll answer via the frequently asked questions documentation. But if you like someone else's question, if you select the thumbs up icon next to it, we'll make sure we try and answer it. We'll also stop for Q&A after each section, and if there is time, we'll have some dedicated Q&A at the end as well. So the agenda, as you can see, we've got some great speakers today. We'll start with Ken from Triple Point, and he'll cover what BHIVE is and why it was set up. We then have Ludo from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, talking about supporting a self-sustaining market with reflections on the dynamic purchasing system and why it's important for market growth. We'll then hear from Steve Ransom and Helen Reid about structuring a heat network project with a case study from Bristol City Leap. Our last speakers will be Richard Turner from Amberside and George Robinson from the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero about using BHIVE and procuring finance through the dynamic purchasing system. We're expecting the event to run to about an hour, depending on the level of discussion. And that's all from me. I'll hand you over to our first speaker, Ken.
Thank you, Rosie. Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all. So why now? Why are we here talking about BHIVE, talking about the role private capital is going to play? Well, I think there's 80 billion reasons. Why 80 billion? Well, that's the received wisdom, certainly the received wisdom of our industry council, of government colleagues, of the current estimate of the investment potential in our district heating sector by 2050. It's a number that's risen several times over the course of the last few years, and for really good reason. The investment potential of the sector has never been higher, for reasons we'll hopefully unpack this afternoon. More exciting still, the industry's never been more investable today. Public and private funds are being used to commercialise and construct district heating networks up and down the land today. If you are still to be convinced about the investment potential of the sector, look no further than recent acquisitions in the supply chain by savvy private equity investors and ask yourself how many times those guys get things wrong. So it's a really exciting opportunity. Great time to come back to you today and talk about the role private capital is going to play in district heating. Next slide, Rosie, please. So, why is this the right time to look at private finance in particular? Well, in a little under an hour today, I'm not sure we're going to answer the philosophical question about whether people think heating infrastructure should be in public or private hands or not. But the reality is that there are any number of local authorities today who already recognise the role district heating is going to play in the lowest cost, low carbon pathway to decarbonised heat, and who don't want to own their infrastructure, or at least don't want to own its entirety. We know too about the pretty parlous state of our public funds, more so than ever, given the inflationary pressures in the market, interest rate rises in the market too. So we don't doubt there's a very significant role for private capital. Beyond that, well, there's still a huge amount of capital support available to projects. My team successfully delivered the Heat Network Investment Project, a £320 million scheme that ran until 2022. But we're also looking after the Green Heat Network Fund. And very many of you will know that that fund has benefited from additional support in the last Green Day announcement. Adjacent to that, well, there's the public sector decarbonisation scheme, and there's a huge amount of other support from the Heat Network Delivery Unit, from our own Triple Point team and delivery partner on those two funds, but also from the likes of the Net Zero hubs as well. I might add that I could have added the UK Investment Bank to that list. It's brilliant that we've got Ludo from DESNES following me along today. I'm hoping Ludo might tell us why the bank identified district heating as a priority asset class for them too. Beyond that, of course, well, there's the huge imperative of net zero. We're not precisely no prospect of meeting net zero by 2050 unless we find a way of decarbonising our built environment. But if that's the clunking environmental imperative, then there's also a particular social imperative too. I don't think anyone overestimates the role district heating is likely to play in creating green jobs in the economy, in taking whole communities out of fuel poverty. Beyond that, well, there's some investor push in this sector. Investors are actively looking for opportunities to invest in low carbon infrastructure. And with the really helpful policy tailwinds of zoning and regulation, providing investor confidence, creating deal flow today, it's a hugely compelling opportunity. Beyond that, and beyond the financial returns, we know today that investors are looking for very much more than just a financial return on their investment. We have that tricksy little acronym ESG. There aren't many investment propositions today that have such a compelling environmental, social and governance angle as district heating. As I say, district heating in a world enhanced by zoning, enhanced by regulation. Last slide for me, please, Rosie, the next one. So if that is about the broader private finance opportunity, why are we here today talking about BHIVE? Well, pretty soon this afternoon, you're going to hear from Richard and from George Robinson talking about the mechanics of BHIVE. But why did we set it up in the first place? Well, we thought it was hugely important to give public sector bodies a frictionless procurement of investment and services associated with that investment, and so developed with our friends at Crown Commercial Services a dynamic purchasing system more than a couple of years ago now. It was set up to help professionalize the market. It has been set up independent of any one supplier, but already has a panel of experienced, capable investors on board on the two lots, asset and equity finance. It gives public sector bodies the ability to access resources to commercialise projects while retaining control of key outcomes. And crucially, it gives local authorities confidence in their ability to unpack and assess different funding options, all the while with support of that supplier panel, but support too of the delivery partner team here today. And that's it from me. A whistle-stop tour of why we think private finance is so crucial to the development of the market today. But it's a real joy to hand you over now to Ludo. Ludo, as I said, joins us from Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, where she's one of two policy leads, but also has that super relevant experience from the UK Infrastructure Bank as well. Ludo, over to you.
Thank you, Ken. Great. Hi, everyone. I recently joined the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero just a couple of months ago with my job share partner, Sam Massey, who works the latter end of the week. And we are the joint deputy directors at the department for heat networks policy and biomethane policy. And the purpose of our role is to drive growth in the sector and ensure we can decarbonise heat. And really, we see our role as doing three things. That's driving investment and market growth as a primary one of the things, driving delivery of heat networks at pace and at scale, and then promoting high standards in the sector, including for consumer protection. So how does this all link to BHIVE and to the attracting private investment in the sector? Well, before I get into that, I will tell you a little bit about what we're doing as the department on the policy landscape and policy framework. So you can see how we're preparing the ground, and we've prepped the ground for heat networks to succeed. So if we go to the next slide, I believe. Oh, there we go. One after this. It's my own introductory slide. There we go. There's 6 things that we're doing in the department, or have done. One is that we're providing funds through the Green Heat Network Fund that Ken's already mentioned. So funding is a big aspect of what we do. But we're also, and this is really important, for enabling private investment, introducing heat network zoning. Now, this is coming through primary legislation, the Energy Security Bill, the Energy Bill, that's going through Parliament at the moment, and will be followed by regulations and guidance and the like. But it's also part of a wider programme we're doing. We've got advanced zoning pilots happening where we're really looking at how to make heat network zones deliverable at pace and at scale. And then on top of that, so the zoning part is a big part of our making this sector more investable than it already is. And then on top of that, we've got we're introducing new regulations again under the energy bill. It's on the primary legislation, which again will follow will follow with further regulations, and we're also improving the performance of our heat networks. And there's a lot more I can say about the wide programme, but if we go to the next slide. Yeah, okay, what this tells you is this is how we see our next couple of years work, and then we're thinking what happens next, because actually for the future we need around 18% of the UK's heat supply to come from heat networks by 2050 if we want the sort of lowest cost decarbonisation pathway for the UK. These might be England figures. It says UK. Let's say UK. So that leaves us with, that's epic amounts of growth we need, and that's where we need the private sector to come in. And actually, before this role, and Ken's mentioned this, I worked for the UK Infrastructure Bank with Sam. And Sam, the UK Infrastructure Bank, most of you will hopefully know, started a couple of years ago to invest in net zero and levelling up regional and local economic growth. And over the sort of previous year and a bit, Sam and I were working there looking at how we increase the bank's investments in the clean heat space, but as well as waste and energy efficiency and retrofit. And heat networks quickly became one of the sectors that the bank recognised it should devote resourcing to assess how it can invest both in local authority projects, but also along the private sector with equity and debt. And so it's one of the bank's five areas where it's keen to invest. And one of the reasons for this is the clear net zero alignment with the UK Infrastructure Bank's objective, and that heat networks provide solutions really to many decarbonisation challenges that many cities are facing. But it was also because of the policy framework that is in train that provides assurance about the investability and the potential success of heat networks. I don't know if I have another slide. Can't remember. These are put together quite quickly. Oh no, Q&A. Right. I will move to BHIVE now. So why BHIVE? So BHIVE will facilitate investment in heat network projects, for which my colleague George, who's coming on a bit later, will be able to expand on the details of. And I hope what you'll see from that detail and what I've shared so far is that this market is investable already, and we've created opportunities for investment in this space, and that BHIVE is one of those pillars for us that we hope you can come in on. I'm going to pause there. Recognize this Q&A. Ken skipped over his Q&A, so if there are questions for me or Ken, maybe we'll take them now, and then we're going to pass on to Steve and Helen, who are going to talk about Bristol City Loop. Thank you.
Thanks, Ludo. We've got one question in the chat so far, which I'll ask in a second. If anyone wants any questions now, as Ludo said, for Ludo or Ken, please do put them in the Q&A section. So we have a question from Bob. If a local authority wants to be prepared for investment at a later date, is there anything specific it needs to put into the SPV that it sets up?
It's a technical question that I will not answer. I wonder if my colleagues want to pick it up right away if they can, or if they'll pick it up when they come in later.
Okay.
I think sorry, Richard, maybe we'll try and pick that up as part of the presentation we're doing a bit later.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bob, we'll make sure we get back to you by the end of this, and if there's any extra detail we can add, we'll make sure it's included in the FAQ documentation as well. Okay, thanks, Ludo. We'll now pass over to Helen and Steve.
Yep, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for inviting us here today. So my name's Steve Ransom, I'm Operations Manager at Bristol City Leap, and I'd like to introduce Helen Reid. And if you could, so we're doing this as a double act in two different places.
Yeah, so I will introduce myself as well. So hello, I'm Helen Reid, and I'm the City Leap client lead for Bristol City Council. I'm actually a lawyer by background, and I worked on the documents and on the procurement for Bristol City Leap while it was going through. And then following the signing and stand up at the beginning of this year, I've taken on the council's client governance team within the council. See if you want to crack on with your slides.
If we could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to do the first few that just describe why we did it and what Bristol City Leap is, and then I'll hand over to Helen to talk around the council's role and the protections that the council has in the contract. So why did we do it? Well, Bristol City Council, I worked at Bristol City Council for many years, and I was head of energy services for the last 3 years until I came across the City Leap, and I was really proud of some of the things that we were able to achieve. We were European Green Capital of the Year. We were the first local authority to declare a climate emergency, and the energy service invested something like £50 million over 5 years, mostly in heat networks. So I think we had a sort of a track record of work that we could be proud of, but it didn't come close to the speed and scale that we need to decarbonise the city. And that's where the idea of Bristol City Leap was born, that we've tried to procure, we decided that we wanted to procure a private sector partner to form a joint venture that would rapidly increase the speed and scale of delivery. Have the next slide, please. So what is it? So the idea was that it would be a new approach that would deliver up to £1 billion worth of low carbon energy infrastructure. So the council overall invested something like 100 million in total over 5 years. So we were talking 10 times that amount, and it would be focused on a range of project types across the sector. So yes, heat networks, but also large scale renewables, energy efficiency measures both commercially and domestically, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure and smarter energy systems. And the idea was that we would mesh together the council's role through its local knowledge and expertise within its energy service with the financial muscle and the resources that the private sector could bring to bear. And this would support the council's decarbonisation targets, so the city's decarbonisation by 2030 and the council's own decarbonisation by 2025. And we'll know that we've really succeeded, I think, not only from our work in Bristol, but when perhaps other local authorities start creating their own model. So the idea is that we could come up with a scalable and replicable model that other cities and authorities may be able to follow. Next slide, please. So what is it? So it's a 20-year concession contract, and Helen will talk a little bit more about how that's structured in a client's time. That was let to Amoresco. Sorry, lights have just gone in here. I'm just going to go wave at the sensor. Energy efficiency. So the contract is with Amoresco UK Limited, and in turn the heat networks are then subcontracted to Vattenfall, so that's the Swedish state-owned utility, in a joint venture. There are two, I think, crucial elements. So one is that the council has pre-procured the partner, which I think for anybody who works in the public sector, they know how time-consuming public sector procurement can be. So Amoresco is pre-procured for low-carbon energy infrastructure, as we've termed it, to deliver on the council's estate, and critically has the right of first refusal. So if Amoresco wishes to develop a project and it meets the criteria that the council has set, and Helen will talk about, then it has the right to do that, and it will be approved by the council. We can't compel the council to invest its money, of course, so that would be a different conversation. But where we wish to develop a project on council land, then we would go through the council's acceptance criteria, and then it would be approved, subject to those criteria being met. Next slide, please. So here are some of the headline commitments. So the 5-year business plan was approved by the council's cabinet last December, and that's a minimum of £424 million over the first 5 years of the business plan. So that's very nearly 10 times the amount that the energy service delivered over the previous 5 years, and then up to £1 billion over the 20-year lifetime of the partnership. We've got a commitment to make the council's own operations, that's its scope 1 and 2 carbon inventory, make that carbon neutral by 2025, to decarbonise the council's social housing stock, that's 27,000 council houses by 2030, and then to substantially expand the council's heat network. So Bristol was, I think, quite unusual in that it had a quite sizable heat network at the point of transfer, and that's being expanded and built out as we speak. And making a material reduction in the overall carbon emissions for Bristol. So it's not a silver bullet. I think the last figure I saw estimating decarbonisation for Bristol was around the £9 billion mark, probably growing since I last saw that estimate. We're talking about a £1 billion investment, but it's certainly going to help. Next slide, please. I think this is really important because it was a council contract, it was a council procurement, it was subject to the council's social value rules. So there's £61.5 million worth of social value within the contract, and some of the highlights are on this page. So that includes creating over 1,000 new jobs over the 5-year business plan, of which 410, I think it is, 410 new jobs to be in Bristol We're developing development funds to support community energy projects to get them to financial closure. We're setting up a £500,000 R&D fund, and there's going to be a community benefit fund, which is going to be based on a small levy on heat sales, which will match to generate 2.8 million over the lifetime of the partnership. And there's a lot more detail that's sat behind this, but I think this is something that is of real benefit to the city, that goes beyond our environmental and carbon targets. We can have a real economic and social benefit for the city at the same time. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over to Helen at this point. She's going to describe the structure of City Leap.
Thanks, Steve. So yes, I get to now sort of explain how this concept is meant to work. So first of all, I think it's quite exciting we can now actually talk about it in more detail, because this procurement has taken us 4 years to get to the stage where we've actually got it signed and City Leap is up and running. And for a lot of that time we wanted to talk about it more widely, but we couldn't, because we were in a competitive procurement with bidders who are obviously commercial entities. So it's great to finally be able to share a bit more detail about what we've managed to achieve. So in terms of how City Leap works, as Steve mentioned, we sort of came up with this idea of we need private sector funding, we need more money, and we need to speed things up. So the first thing was, well, what can we offer? What can we tempt the private sector in with? So we've got the council on one side, and what we've done is we've effectively offered up access to our estate. We've said, with City Council, we've got a certain amount of estate that you can go at for low carbon energy infrastructure projects, and our strategic partner has the right of first refusal for low carbon projects on those bits of land. And so the council is one half of this partnership. And then we have our strategic partner, who we have appointed following our procurement, and Ameresco was the successful bidder in that. But we needed a way for both the council and the strategic partner to come together, and we felt actually having a joint venture company was the best way to achieve that kind of shared interest. So we've established Bristol City Leap as a separate entity, and the main role of Bristol City Leap as the joint venture is to originate project ideas. So as Steve mentioned, he was in the council, he was part of our energy service team who delivered a lot of our energy projects. That energy service team moved into Bristol City Leap as part of this transaction, and they are now continuing their role to come up with projects across the council's estate and more widely in Bristol, but taking a more strategic approach to decarbonisation to make sure that we're really pushing at that envelope in terms of finding the finance and also delivering at speed and at pace. Ameresco bid in as the strategic partner. They've got a lot of experience in delivering low carbon infrastructure projects. They've done that across the UK, and probably a lot of people on this call might have come across them through that. They have bid in as part of their structure with an essential subcontractor, and that is Vattenfall, who have got obviously a huge amount of experience with heat networks. So it's quite a good partnership from our point of view, because part of the delivery for City Leap, a large part of the decarbonisation across the city is going to be delivered through delivering heat networks across Bristol. So hopefully that sort of gives you a bit of an overview as to what the structure looks like and how it's going to work. We've got Bristol City Council working with Ameresco and Vattenfall, with this central joint venture company being the kind of meeting point for all of us to come together to keep it working towards the main key objectives that we have for City Leap. If we go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the actual procurement and the concession, so there are a few key elements really. I mean, I'm not going to take you through the whole document, it's about 400 pages long, so we would be here all day. But some of the key elements of it. So first of all, we established a joint venture company, and as part of that, we've got City Leap come up with a business plan each year, and that comes to Bristol City Council for us to look at and say, actually, yeah, we're happy with what you're proposing to be done. We think that meets certain criteria that we've set in the concession. That JV company also then acts as our outward face of City Leap. We thought it was really important as a council that, you know, we couldn't just bring in someone from the private sector that citizens of Bristol had never heard of and say, come and let them do this energy efficiency work. So come and connect to our heat network that's run by these people. So we've got this brand, this City Leap brand that Bristol City Council is a part of, and hopefully this JV Co will act as a good hook for people to get involved with City Leap and decarbonisation across the city going forward. And as I said before, it means that we can come together to make sure we're meeting the strategic objectives of City Leap. So it's a 50-50 JV company. We've both shareholders in it. We've both got directors appointed to it, both Bristol City Council and Ameresco. So we're making sure that strategically the partnership is heading in the right direction through the operation of the JV company. In the concession, we also had a number of KPIs, which we have contractually bound Ameresco to. And this was to make sure that we could enforce the commitments that they made on the bids. So those very impressive numbers that Steve talked you through a few moments ago around social value and around carbon savings, those are contractual commitments that Ameresco have got to meet over the next few years of the concession. And we made sure that those KPIs covered a range of things. Obviously, carbon saving was one of the most important, and social value, but also development KPIs, so around the actual technologies that are being deployed. We've got specific operational KPIs around the heat network and the carbon content and customer experience and journeys for the heat network. And we've got additional KPIs around things like community participation, because for the council, it was really important that the whole of the Bristol population is brought along with the City Leap journey. The other sort of key element of the concession is making sure we've got this project approval process, which Steve has touched on. So this is really where we are protecting, this is the way we've protected the council's interests through the whole of the City Leap concession. And this is a staged gateway approval process. So any projects that are being proposed through City Leap have to go through this approval process before they can go ahead on our estate. And there's a number of key criteria that a project has to meet. And the team that I manage, the City Leap client team, is responsible for that assurance element, for making sure that those projects are meeting those criteria. And for working with City Leap, if it doesn't look like a project will meet that criteria, well, how do we make sure it is going to meet that criteria? What can they change in order to make sure it is going to satisfy our requirements? And that was a really, really crucial element for the council to include in this procurement, because obviously going forward, where we have low carbon energy projects, we're not going to be going out to a competitive tender because we have our pre-procured partner. So this is our assurance to make sure that we are getting value for money on projects, to make sure that there's no conflict in terms of how our resources or our land needs to be used, to make sure we've got certain key legal requirements that we want in the contractual documents going forward. So this was a really, really crucial element for our governance. And then the sort of final slightly unusual element of the concession that was really important was what we're calling strategic city asset protections. And this was a set of additional specific protections on top of the project approval process that we require for any projects for strategic city assets. And strategic city assets are really things where there could be a monopoly being created, or where there's something which, if there was an energy infrastructure that was no longer provided, it could actually impact on Bristol citizens' ability to receive energy within the city. So for those types of assets, what we have done is included additional requirements around how those assets are held, how those assets are, how the assets are priced, how customers are kept informed about pricing, and in terms of how assets are continued to be operated throughout their lifetime. And there's a requirement in there for the council to take a special share if we require it in relation to those assets. And we did this in relation to the heat network, which is really why I wanted to draw it out in this talk today, because obviously as part of City Leap, we had a heat network that we had as a council started to build out, and which we have transferred across into City Leap as part of these arrangements. And in sort of the face of there not being national regulation around heat networks, we wanted some additional protections to make sure that customers would continue to receive fair and transparent pricing going forward, and that the heat stayed on. So what we've done is we've taken a special share in our heat network company that we used to own, and that gives us additional protections in the event that Vattenfall tried to sort of turn the heat off, if you like. So we have this additional level of protection in place. I think that's it in terms of the key bits of the concession to draw out today. But what I did want to follow up next is just to sort of say, well, what next for City Leap? Because we're obviously 6 months into it now. So far, it's going well. Steve and I are still talking to each other, which is a good sign. And if we move on to the next slide, actually, that would be good. But what we really hope is that this is going to work really well in Bristol, and we are starting to see the projects being delivered under City Leap, which is great. We've had projects go through that project approval process successfully, and we've got City Leap and Amoresco in actually delivering for us now. But we think this is a model which is actually replicable. We think it is scalable. I know there's been a lot of interest from local authorities. I've pretty much daily getting email queries in from local authorities wanting to talk about City Leap and understand what it is. And actually, if we can get some support, it would be great to see it being rolled out, perhaps with a central government taking a role in terms of creating some kind of standardised set of legal documents, so that other cities can sort of look at this model and utilise it themselves. Let's go on to the next slide. I think there were a few challenges that we faced and we overcame. It was not a cheap procurement process, I will say that now. I forget the exact figure, but it was very high millions. And I question in my mind whether the council would now, in the current economic climate, have the risk appetite to start it from scratch at this day and this particular moment.
Sorry, is that just Helen or is it me as well?
No, I think we've lost Helen. Steve,
Okay.
do you want to come in?
I can speak to the rest of this. So yes, so as Helen was saying, the procurement process was very long and very expensive. But there were reasons behind that. So as far as we know, this is a world first. So all of the documentation had to be written from scratch. And it was trying to do 3 different things at the same time. So the first was to develop the concession agreement, which we've which Helen's been talking about. But Bristol already had an existing heat network, a council-owned heat network, so that had to be prepared for sale. So there was an M&A piece of work that had to be done with that, and that probably took us more time than anything else. It proved to be quite challenging at times because we were having to separate out sort of secondary and primary parts of the network that were not necessarily put together contractually with that in mind when they were first developed. My light's gone off again, so I've got one person who can't speak. The person you can't see, right? And then the last thing was because we had a large energy service. It was one of the largest, if not the largest, in the UK. There's about 40 people in the energy service, and we had to run a 2p consultation, which was my particular piece of fun last year, which was to run that consultation. So you put those 3 things together, and plus being the first, that's why it's very lengthy and very expensive. And I think, if I was to estimate, I would think that a similar sized local authority starting today that perhaps didn't have a large energy service, didn't have a heat network, could probably do it in half the time and cost that we had to bear to make it happen. Well, Helen, I think are you back with us? Sorry, you dropped out, so I spoke for you.
I think I am, but you delivered that bit perfectly, Steve. So feel free to carry on.
I know, just to emphasise what Helen's been talking about. That I've seen this before in other sectors. That if there's no council team to manage the contract, it will fall apart. So I'm so pleased that that Helen's here and her team to manage it from their side. So just to give you one example, we're currently delivering domestic retrofit under the Hub 2 scheme. But actually the contract's with the council, it's not with us. We're doing the operational delivery, but the council's on the hook for it. So it has to have people who are managing its interests and sort of keeping us honest, if you like. And the last point about one of the key takeaways from me is the sheer amount of social value that we can bring to Bristol. We talk about a just transition, but here it is. This is a reality. We can bring new jobs into Bristol. We can target. We're looking at ways of targeting areas of deprivation. We can really achieve our economic and our environmental goals. So I think that's something. A public-private partnership of this nature has the potential to really deliver in a way that we've not seen before.
Great, thank you, Steve and Helen.
That was the last slide, I think.
Yeah. So, as unsurprisingly, that was obviously really interesting. We've had quite a few questions in the chat. I'm aware that we've got one speaker slot left, so we'll have to restrict how many questions we can answer now. However, anything that we don't answer, we will obviously make sure is included in the frequently asked questions documentation and share it. I will read a few questions from the chat and then we'll have to move on to the final speakers. So we have got one from Paul. Is Bristol City Council co-investing in the projects undertaken by the joint venture, i.e. sharing in financial risk and return? If so, in what proportion?
So it will depend on each project that is put forward, and there is no obligation on the council to invest in those projects. The presumption is actually that Amresco will provide the financing and will come up with the funding model for the projects. Now, there are some projects that are going to be grant funded, and as Steve suggested, and in those scenarios, then we're utilising the grant funding to develop the projects. Depending on the terms of the grant funding, depend on how we do it, obviously. And then those, it's relatively straightforward, sort of standard business model you'd expect. It's pay to build out the project. But in others, for example, with large scale renewables, we'll be looking at other different financing models, and there is no obligation for us to invest unless we want to be involved and the business case stacks up, and there's the money there to do it.
Great, thanks, Helen. And another question, do you know what percentage return is for a private investor? Are they looking for 10%?
I don't think, I don't think you can be that generalist. I mean, it will depend on the type of project, won't it, and what the risk level is of a particular project. So, that's something that will vary.
Yeah, it's a commercial decision for us, so if we were taking more risk, if we were looking at something like around an EPC or an energy as a service type model, then that there are more risks that would fall upon us, and so then we might be looking at a higher return in order to sort of cover off that risk.
Great, thank you. Okay, and another question. If a private investor is onboarded along with a local authority, how do you safeguard the consumer from a heavy tariff to ensure a return for both the local authority and private investor?
So I don't know if this is respective heat networks that we're referring to here. If that's the case, then the way that the tariff is calculated is publicly available and it's index linked. So Vattenfall are not not allowed to simply put the price up to whatever they like. There's a process they have to go through, which is written into the contract that sets out how they arrive at that tariff.
We'll ask one more final question before we move on to our last set of speakers. So this is from Dave Pearson from Star Refrigeration. Our first big heat pump we manufactured in Glasgow, the one for Bristol, Drummond concession holder is obligated to connect any building inside the zone that wants district heating. So no refusal, not first refusal. How does Bristol handle this obligation?
Well, thanks, Dave. I'll just say that that was the largest purchase order I ever signed when I was in the council. I remember it quite well. So I think that this might be conflating two different issues possibly. So in terms of connecting buildings into the district heating network, that's a planning obligation. Well, it's not an obligation, but you'd have to come up with a very good reason why not, I suppose, if I can put it that way. Whereas what we're talking around is rights of first refusal to deliver works on the council's estate. So if, to give you one example, we identified a piece of council land where we'd like to develop a solar park, then we would agree a rental with the council, but the council couldn't refuse us doing that, provided that we met the council's project acceptance criteria, provided that we were funding it. Whereas I think here around the what this appears to be talking about, I think, is the connection to the district heating zone. So if a developer's bringing forward a new building within the zone in Bristol, then they have to follow the heat hierarchy that's set out through planning.
Great, fantastic. There's lots more questions, but we'll move on to our final speakers, and then hopefully we'll have a bit more time at the end to catch up with a few more. Thanks very much, Steve and Helen. Okay, so now we have George Robinson from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and Richard Turner from Amberside.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Richard Turner here from Amberside. I think I'm going to be doing much of the talking, and George will chip in as we go through and supporting the Q&A. But thanks also to Steve and Helen. I think it's a great example of a joint venture in action, and it's relevant to BHIVE, as I'll hopefully try and explain through the next few slides. Perhaps before talking about why BHIVE, I better explain what BHIVE is. And it's a procurement route. It's a dynamic purchasing system, which, as Ken said, we set up a couple of years ago, and it's a route to market for public sector bodies in England and Wales who want a heat network to be developed, to find a partner, a joint venture partner, to help them deliver it. So it's if we talk about why BHIVE, I mean, Ken's given some of the backdrop around the need for enormous amounts of private capital to come into the sector. And we think BHIVE is a really effective way for local authorities to find a partner that brings active capital. And by active capital, we mean it's not really about the money. The money is important, but it's really about having a partner who's got the skill sets and the people that can help you deliver, commercialise and then deliver your heat network. So those services, commercialisation services, is really the sort of hub of what BHIVE is about. It's the procurement of those commercialisation services and the funding. It's important to say it's not about procuring supply chain. It is about that partner, investment partner, who can bring those skill sets, those commercialisation services. And therefore, we think it's, as a procurement in itself, it should be simpler, quicker and cheaper than a procurement where you're wrapping in lots of other parts of the delivery, such as construction operations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. And one of the reasons and things we've been for using BHIVE and things we've been exploring with the department recently is how it can be used earlier in the commercialisation phase, and we think probably earlier than some other procurement routes, because you are procuring a commercialisation partner. Obviously, by definition, they are there to commercialise the project. So bringing somebody on board when you've done enough work to ensure you can get a proper competition, and then investors can price their response properly around those services. But you can bring them in quite early in that commercialisation phase to support you in that in delivering those commercialisation services. If we just go on to the next slide. So as I said, it's a PCR compliant platform for active capital. There are actually two lots. There's an equity lot, which is the commercialisation services and equity funding, and there's a separate asset finance lot. It's open to all public sector heat network developers and owners in England and Wales. Scotland have got their own arrangements. We've been actively onboarding investors for some time now. I think we're up to 13 on lot 1, the equity side, and we're still onboarding people, and they're a good mix of ranging from larger energy suppliers to financial investors. It is separate to the Green Heat Network Fund, but it's specifically been designed to work alongside it. So under GHNF, there's an ability to apply for a provisional award. So you could apply for commercialisation and construction grant under a provisional award with the intention of then going to BHIVE, which means you could come to market for your partner with a pot of money for commercialisation and construction, and then when you come out to tender under BHIVE. It runs to March 2025. It's just been extended by 2 years by the department from its original date. And it can be used to finance a new heat network, to expand an existing one, or potentially refinance, sell part or all of an existing operational network. Just go on to the next slide, please. It's worth talking about some of the drivers and perhaps some of the change we've seen in the market over the past 4 years, so that we've been working on the HNIP and now GHNF programs. I think when we started those conversations, most projects we were looking at were local authority led, usually with PWLB funding, and not enormous appetite for private sector involvement. I think the conversations we've been having over the past 12-18 months, we've seen that change significantly. And increasingly public sector not wanting to own, or at least own outright, their heat network that they want to develop. They want a partner on board. Often they may recognise that they don't have the skills in-house or the financial resources, as particularly local authority finances come under greater strain, but also recognition that delivery of these projects in-house comes with risk. And there have been some high profile failures in the sort of energy and district heating space with local authority schemes. So they come with significant risk, and whilst PWLB funding is cheap, it doesn't reflect the risk that the full ownership means the public sector is taking. But often public sector wants to retain some control over the future development of the network and how it's delivered. And BHIVE and the joint venture approach allows that to be done, we think, in a very flexible way without having to try and spell everything out on day one. You can use the joint venture agreement as the tool for the public sector exerting control over the development of the heat network. From the private sector side, we've seen, as Ken mentioned, investors being really attracted by the strong ESG impact of district heating schemes against the backdrop of zoning and new regulation, giving investors confidence that this really is a growing sector, and giving them confidence to invest. We've also seen increasing secondary market activity with portfolios coming to market, which means that investors who haven't traditionally invested in this sector are now seeing existing schemes, getting their heads around the risks, and getting much more comfortable and good understanding what the sector involves. And we know there are investors out there, and we've got BHIVE with the skills to optimise, commercialise and deliver district heating schemes at scale. Next slide, please. So very briefly how it works. It's really a two-stage process, or three-stage process really. We've been onboarding, as I said, investors onto BHIVE, which is the first stage. Then the step one of that's in this example a local authority using BHIVE would be to come to market on the BHIVE platform with a project sufficiently well scoped that the JV partner can price up the services and understand what sort of investment is required. But as I said before, potentially reasonably early in the commercialisation phase. And so you produce a tender document, do probably some pre-market engagement with these investors on BHIVE. It's a one-hit bid process. It's not a negotiated procedure. So we'd use that pre-market engagement really to get feedback on the tender documents and the joint venture agreement. You then appoint your joint venture partner, and then step 2 is that the joint venture would then commercialise the project through optimising it, design completion, negotiating the customer contracts, the supply chain procurement, and putting the funding in place. And that would all be done in joint venture with the local authority. Next slide, please. So I know that some local authorities have a sort of implicit or explicit dislike for joint ventures, but I think Bristol is showing the way in terms of how a joint venture can be made to work. And there are lots of examples in other sectors like local asset-backed vehicles where joint ventures with local authorities have delivered. But it really can be anything ranging from a full joint venture, 50-50 ownership, right through to a sort of notional golden share where a local authority could put in a £1 golden share to give it certain rights through the joint venture agreement. Alternatively, the local authority could invest in different ways. It could put money in, it could put existing assets in, for example, for an energy centre or existing energy centre, or land for a new one. Or, as I said, it could just be limited to a golden share. The private sector then brings its skills through in terms of commercialisation and expertise, funding and delivery. And then the local authority influences and controls through the voting rights under that joint venture agreement, or through reserved matters for shareholders. And I guess why we think it's flexible is because you can have a limited number of controls spelled out in the joint venture agreement, which everybody is aware of up front. And you don't then have to have a sort of complex variation mechanism. Everybody knows that certain decisions will have to be made in partnership through that joint venture agreement. If we just go to the next slide, please. So what does the local authority bring? Well, obviously the desire to build a new or build out an existing heat network, and potentially that contribution of land, financial equity, potentially heat loads, and also grant funding through that provisional award process under GH&F. So you come to market with an agreed pot of commercialisation money and construction grants to improve the economics of the project. And what does the partner bring? Obviously funding, but critically those commercialisation services, expertise and people. Next slide, please. One of the things we've again been looking at with the department, and we're looking at a specific project with them to work this up in some detail, is that we think BHIVE can be used more on an outcomes-based approach, which means again, with an example of a local authority, potentially setting the in the bid documents what heat tariff it wants, so the formula for that, the indexation, what the carbon intensity of the network needs to be, minimum heat load, minimum service requirements. So some of those things that Steve and Helen were talking about in the Bristol City Leap example around the tariff and the KPIs, but as outcomes for the network, rather than specifying detailed inputs around exactly what technology has to be, size of heat pumps, etc. And then that would be set out in the bid tender documents, and bid back items from the private sector could be, what level of risk that the partner is willing to take on the cost to commercialise the project, what the experience and of the team that they're actually willing to put on the project is, what their minimum hurdle IRR rates are, and then methodologies for how they're going to procure supply chain and grow the network. One thing about the joint venture approach is, depending on the level of involvement from the local authority, will determine whether or not that joint venture then needs to apply PCR or UCR in the procurement of the supply chain. And it's quite a complex issue that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case example. But we think there are circumstances where, once you appoint that joint venture partner, it may have more flexibility in terms of how it then procures the supply chain. Next slide, please. So just summarise again, key benefits of BHIVE: speed, because it's initial procurement of an investment partner, not the full supply chain. It can be done quickly. It's a much narrower scope of procurement, so therefore the actual procurement itself, that element of it is should be lower cost. The flexibility over time through a relatively straightforward joint venture agreement, and continuing control from the public sector through shareholding or potentially golden share. And final slide. I think I've talked about who it's open to, but it's basically all public sector bodies in England and Wales, which is, as well as local authorities, includes universities, NHS trusts, non-departmental public bodies, for example. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. There is more information available. I'll put the link on the next slide. I'm very happy to ask George and I any questions.
Thank you very much. We've got a huge amount of questions through, so we'll begin to get to some of them. I just want to flag that I think Ludo has to drop off at 3, unfortunately. So any questions that Ludo would answer, we will have to get back to you afterwards. But I believe we have everybody else around for a little bit longer, so we'll get going on some of the questions. We've got one for Helen and maybe Steve. Does or will City Leap have sub companies within it to separate the different projects with different risk profiles?
So I can probably take that one, but actually I also need to drop off at 3, I'm afraid. So
Okay.
This might have to be
Don't
my
worry.
first and only question. So we purposefully left, I mean, it's quite interesting talking through just the BHIVE just now about the flexibility. We purposefully left the structure of City Leap flexible. So if Amoresco want to set up SPVs to hold the assets, they can do so, and they will sit under that structure underneath Amoresco. But if they don't want to do that, then they don't have to.
Helen. A further question: is there a particular level of project IRR that an investor considers to be desirable with regards to potential financial investment?
Want me to take that one? I think it's very project dependent, as I think I referred to in an earlier question. It's going to depend on the level of risk that we have to take on. So we have a margin that we would apply to on an open basis with the council, but that will go up or down depending. So, for example, grant funding could be a bit lower, but if we were taking on something like an EPC or an energy service type project, then it would be a bit higher.
Thanks, Steve. Also, I'll revisit a question that we answered earlier that Richard might have touched on. And it was if a local authority wanted to be prepared for investment at a later date, is there anything specific it needs to put into the SPV that it sets up meanwhile?
I mean, BHIVE is about finding that joint venture partner. So in theory, I guess there's nothing stopping a local authority setting up an SPV to progress things, and then with a view to using BHIVE to bring in a partner into that SPV. I think we've touched on the sort of minimum things you need to think about for certainly an outcomes-based approach to using BHIVE, which is around what you're really trying to get out of the network, whether it's carbon intensity, the tariff, minimum heat loads delivered, timescales, etc. So those are the sort of things that I think need to think about. When you come to tender, what are you going to come to? What's going to be in the tender document in terms of your requirements, and what are you going to be asking bidders to bid against? George, whether you've got anything else to add?
I think from a local authority perspective, having incorporated an SPV in advance could be helpful just from a governance perspective. One of the challenges, I'd say one of the biggest issues in a way with BHIVE is the fact that you have a shareholders agreement, and that can be difficult from an approvals perspective. And I know that many people in the sector are looking at the kind of joint development agreement model. So if you have already overcome that issue and incorporated that SPV, you've sort of addressed that. So for me, that would be a helpful start. And then you would negotiate with the joint venture partner, or you'd establish effectively in advance the procurement what the shareholders agreement would need to factor in. So some of those areas that Richard was setting out around minimum performance standards and so on. But having already incorporated the SPV, I think would be a helpful start.
Thanks, George. Steve, another one for you, which looks like it might be quite helpful for everybody. You said that you want Bristol City Leap to give a replicable model. Are you preparing any materials or guides that other councils can use?
So I'm not. So this is one for the council, really. Unfortunately, Helen's left. But in terms of conversations that we've had, our personal view is that there's a role that the UK government could play in providing a suite of off-the-shelf contracts that could be adaptive for local authorities who are looking to go down this path. I mean, that's just a personal view. Other than that, I know that Amoresco is talking to other local authorities about, potentially doing their own City Leap. So I think it would be one for Helen to talk about what the council might want to do with its IP, because it generated a huge amount of IP over the course of the procurement that I suspect it wouldn't necessarily want to just give away.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, and another question: if the key performance indicators are not met, what recourse do you have? Often there's no easy route out or means of enforcement, thus nullifying the values of having KPIs.
Yeah, there are financial penalties. Don't ask me what they are because I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are penalties in the contract. So, for example, if we didn't deliver on our carbon targets quickly enough, or we didn't deliver on our social value targets around creation of new jobs, say, then there are penalties that sit behind those for non-compliance.
Thank you. And just because this question has come up, I think 3 times so far, it might be worth just speaking about if Bristol Leap did use BHIVE, and if so, how?
No, that's quite an easy one to answer.
Okay.
I think the Bristol City Leap started before BHIVE was sort of up and running.
We were sort of through the other side. So City Leap, the procurement took, as I said, in the presentation, it was a very long-term thing for us. So it was about 4 years, which I think a few people might be sort of, I don't know if their jaws are dropping. I think you could do it in 18 months to 2 years if you were starting from scratch now. There were some specific circumstances around what we were trying to do that just meant it took a lot longer.
Thank you. And lots of questions for you, Steve.
That's all right.
Can private sector and residential consumers procure services through City Leap as well?
Not really, no. There are some very limited circumstances in which other organisations can access the City Leap contract, but it is a Bristol City Council contract, so that we run pretty quickly into procurement rules trouble, if you like. So I think I'm right in saying that some of the local authorities can use professional services, but in terms of physical delivery, it's a council contract. So householders, if they were using City Leap, it would be because they're accessing a scheme like, say, Hub2 that we happen to be delivering on behalf of the council.
Great, thank you. And what happens to Bristol City Leap at the end of the 20-year concession term?
I saw that come up, and there is an answer to that question. I just can't remember what it is. I'm sorry. It is written into the contract what happens at the end of the concession, but I really can't remember.
Thank you, that's fine. Okay, we can get back to you on that one. Okay, we've got one from Dan Fernbank from the Uni of Reading. As a university with its own district heat network supplying its own buildings, private sector investment has previously looked difficult because it is likely viewed from an accounting perspective as sitting on our books, i.e. borrowing. Has BHIVE considered this and found a way to address it, or is it not suitable for a self-owned / supplied network?
So we are looking at it in the context, not with the university, but with a large NHS trust, which has the same sort of accounting issues. I haven't got the answer at the moment, I'm afraid. It's again, it's quite a difficult, can be quite a difficult question to answer, depending on the esoteric nature of public accounting.
But it also comes down to risk and control, and so a lot will depend on the scale that Richard set out of the full JV. Likelihood is it's coming on books as you go down towards the golden share, depending on the extent of the control that is sort of inherent within those reserve matters. will start to influence whether it is or on or off a balance sheet. But as Richard said, being explored. But clearly, the closer you are to that 50-50, it's going to be on balance sheet as you get closer and closer to golden share. Those are the kind of models where not only would be looking to be off balance sheet, but ideally now within the utilities contracting regulations rather than the public contracting regulations, which is kind of what Richard was talking to for that supply chain procurement.
Thank you. And I think another one for Richard and George. Could you please clarify how BHIVE allows turnkey asset delivery contracts to be procured, e.g. D&B /DBOM? I was not sure about that acronym, sorry, of the network.
I think the so part of the bid back would be how that partner would then deliver the supply chain. And I think there's flexibility for how that could then be done. So it could be procuring individual contracts for construction and operations. It could be right through to a full DBOM procurement where you wrap everything in. And the joint venture partner and the public sector partner would work together on that that route to market.
Thanks, Richard. Another question, is there an optimal time for a district heat network project to come to BHIVE? We are at early commercialisation and I'm interested in how this would work, taking into account the fairly challenging GH&F construction timescales. Thank you.
Well, as I said, I think fairly early in the commercialisation stage, we think BHIVE could be very effective because you're not procuring the whole supply chain at that stage. You don't need to work the project up to the same level, and if you're doing an outcomes-based approach, you really need enough information to allow an investor to be able to price the commercialization services and to understand the sort of level of funding it would need to put in. But that's an earlier stage, I think, than some other procurement routes. So yeah, early stage commercialization, we think it can work. Obviously, it all depends on project specifics, and we're very happy to have one-to-one conversations with people around their specific projects.
Just to add, I mean, I'd say the absolute earliest would be when if you're following the heat network delivery unit sort of time scale, it would be the point where you've completed a detailed feasibility, but have made a decision internally that you know that you do not have the appetite to invest in the network and own that infrastructure, or at least not as a majority equity stakeholder. If you're aware of that, then at that point it would make sense to start engaging with BHIVE because you've got sufficient detail of your project, its scope, and then can start forming some of those key metrics for an outcomes-based procurement. If, however, it's unclear at that stage, then you'd be going through detailed project development if you're a local authority, and effectively your business case at that point would justify the route to market and have evaluated that BHIVE was the way to go. But you can be as early as detailed feasibility, I'd say.
And in a competitive funding process like the Green Heat Network Fund, projects will fare better in competition against their peers if they've tested the availability of private capital first. So yes, at the earliest possible stage, George's warning notwithstanding.
Thank you. Okay, and this is just a bit of helpful information from Paul. Another good case study of a local authority-led procurement of a joint venture partner for energy projects is Midlothian Council, which procured Vattenfall as its 50-50 joint venture partner, which predates the Bristol City Leap example, albeit on a smaller scale. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay, let me just look at a few more questions. There was a question about how does BHIVE interface with DPD process from HNDU, which I think is Heat Networks Delivery Unit?
Yeah, so as I was saying, it would interface if you were going down the business case route. So you're doing an outline business case as part of the detailed project development stage of the HNDU sort of steps. Then BHIVE would be an option within the commercial case that would be considered as a potential route to market, and looking to effectively price how much is it going to cost to commercialize the project. And potentially, and to me, this is where BHIVE is quite important, is that you're now looking to effectively get a price on how much it will cost the authority to now get the project delivered, without necessarily the authority having to invest. You can do the golden share route, but you might also contribute, potentially land for an energy centre. But DPD stage, now with the business case and engagement with BHIVE, could sort of get you to a point where you say, yes, we approve this route to market, and then that would effectively now step you into stage 1 of commercialization, which is procuring your partner. And then depending on your level of ownership and control of the project or that joint venture, that would then sort of dictate how much effort needs to go into the procurement of the supply chain. So if you're just essentially, as an authority, a silent participant, or relatively silent, just sort of relying on the golden share, then it's down to your delivery partner to effectively undertake that. But they've told you how much it's going to cost you to fully commercialize that project. So now, from a budget perspective and within your final business case, you are clear on that. Other routes to market, as I see them, are slightly less clear on that. How much will it cost the authority to commercialize the project? And to me, that is quite a useful aspect of this. But the DPD stage would need to have justified entering into effectively a formal shareholders agreement, joint venture agreement with the partner, and that can be challenging for local authorities, and so it would need to be addressed then. So that's how I see DPD stage and BHIVE interfacing.
Thanks, George. So we've got a further clarification from a company currently in Northern Ireland who operate Europe-wide. They have lots of clients in England, and I'd like to know, even if they're registered in Northern Ireland, will they be able to use BHIVE even if the client is in England or Scotland?
It depends whether they're talking about going on to BHIVE as an investor or as a customer, public sector customer using it. I mean, it's for public sector customers, it's England, it's in England and Wales. So any public sector organisation in England and Wales. But I don't think there's a constraint in terms of who can go on to BHIVE, as long as you can meet the various requirements under the selection questionnaire that you have to complete.
Great, thank you, Richard. Okay, I think we're probably going to wrap up in a couple of questions. Shall we get back to you if we haven't answered your question during this webinar? If BHIVE allows procurement of delivery contracts through the bid-back mechanism, is the procurement actually a public works or services or concession type contract rather than procurement of finance or ancillary services? The public procurement implications can be quite different.
So the bid-back, I think, would be a method statement of how your joint venture partner would expect to go around procuring supply chain, and it could be around value for money, how they're going to demonstrate value for money through a process. So it's not procuring supply chain through BHIVE. It is about having a methodology for how your partner and the joint venture would then go and procure supply chain, and that could be around things as simple as transparency and demonstrating value for money.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, and what are the estimated timescales, firstly, to procure a BHIVE partner, and secondly, to undertake commercialization, and thirdly, to procure a DBOM partner?
Well, the first bit of that, BHIVE, I think we've put a sort of indicative timeline in the back of the guidance, which is on the final slide. You can find the link to it. I can't off the top of my head, but it's months. It's a few months we're talking about. The actual procurement exercise itself, so the tender, is relatively short. Probably the time needs to go into making sure that the tender document does what you want it to do. But the actual procurement bit is short. Only, you could probably give people 2 to 3 months process to go through that. Gosh, how long is commercialisation and procuring DBOM? It very much depends on the project, how complex it is, how far into commercialisation you are. I'm not sure that's an easy one to answer or give a clear answer on.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, and the attendee numbers are dropping now, so I'll make this our last question. Does BHIVE link up investors with heat network commercialisation specialists, or are investment teams expected to bring these skills?
So the investment team, your joint venture partner, would bring the skill sets that they might need to then bring in external consultants to support them. The key is that they have the skill sets to be able to manage a commercialisation process, but that certainly doesn't preclude sort of specialist advisors, whether it's legal, technical, insurance, etc., to be procured to work with the joint venture.
Great. All right, thank you so much, everybody. We've had such an engaged audience, so hopefully you found that really useful. And thanks so much to our speakers as well for providing your insights. Further guidance and contacts you can see on the slides here. So there's a link there to the website and also a contact for Jack from Amberside. We will circulate these slides. It's also going to be recorded, so we'll make sure that's uploaded to YouTube and you have a link shared. And then once we've been had a chance to collate all the questions and make sure we have an answer to all of them, we'll share that as well. So thanks again for attending, and I hope you found it helpful.